please, this morning, let's take our Bibles, and I want to ask you to turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 19. On Thursday evening, we looked at Jeremiah, just a little bit of Jeremiah chapter 18, which is the story of the potter and the clay. But I want us to look this morning at the 19th chapter of Jeremiah. So as you turn there, remember 18, the clay, the potter, and the wheel. And all of that was a warning of the judgment that was to come. That God could remake, as the potter could remake the clay into a usable vessel if the clay was willing to be reformed and reshaped. We know that Thursday evening, the last verse of the portion of Scripture of 18 that we read said that the people more or less said, no, we're not going to repent, we're not going to turn, we're going to do as the evil that is in our hearts. And so they made up their mind they were not going to turn away from their ungodliness and their ungodly ways. And so we read in chapter 19 of the book of Jeremiah, verse 1. Thus saith the Lord, talking to Jeremiah, go and get a potter's earthen bottle, and take of the ancients of the people and of the ancients of the priests, and go forth into the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is by the entry of the east gate, and proclaim there the words that I shall tell thee. And say, hear ye the word of the Lord, O King of Judah, and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will bring evil upon this place, the which whosoever heareth, their ears shall tingle, or they will be delighted. People will be delighted to hear what God has done in judgment against Jerusalem. Of course, they're enemies, because they have forsaken me, and have estranged this place, and have burned incense in it unto other gods, whom neither they nor their fathers have known, nor the kings of Judah, and have filled this place with the blood of innocents. They have built also the high places of Baal, to burn their sons with fire for the burnt offerings unto Baal, which I commanded not, nor spake it, neither came it into my mind. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that this place shall no more be called Topheth, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. Now, we know that in verse 10 and verse 11, now verse 1 says that Jeremiah was to go by the potter, and he was to get a clay bottle, one that had been finished, one that had been fired, one that was set, for sale. This was not a water pot, it was just a bottle, a small earthen vessel. And he was to take the leaders of Judah, the leaders of Jerusalem, the prominent people, out by the eastern gate. Not at the eastern gate, but the gate by. And he was to take them out there and proclaim God's judgment upon them and upon the nation. And how that God is going to bring about this judgment, and how God is going to turn the place into a desolate place. The people, when they saw it, would hiss at it. They would be astonished. They would be surprised at how destroyed the great city of Jerusalem would be under God's judgment. So, we find that in verse 10 and verse 11, thus, then saith thou, or then, wait a minute, then shalt thou break the bottle in the sight of the men that go with thee, and shall say unto them, thus saith the Lord of hosts, even so will I break this people and this city, as one breaketh a potter's vessel, that cannot be made whole again. They shall bury them in Tophet till there be no more place to bury. Or in other words, the breaking of the vessel was the breaking of Israel, or breaking of Judah. And that vessel, once, unlike the clay in the potter's hands, once it is fired, once it is set, if it breaks, it's ruined. It can't be remade, it can't be put back together. And God is saying, that's what I'm going to do to you. I am going to destroy you. They were going into Babylonian captivity because of their ungodliness for 7 years. He was telling that generation, you will never see Jerusalem in this state again. You will die in captivity, and it will be generations down the road before they get to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild it, and of course rebuild the temple and so forth. But you and your generation, you will not see it this way anymore. I'm going to destroy it. That's what God, like Jeremiah throwing that clay vessel onto the rocks and it going into 1,000,000 different pieces. It cannot be fixed. Or in other words, God said, you're refusing to repent. So judgment is coming. There's no way out of it. And that clay vessel was to prove that. There's no way out. You've made your choice, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences of it. And of course, we know that God did bring judgment in the Babylonian captivity and so forth. Now, for a little understanding of what is taking place and what he's talking about. There are 3 mounts associated with the city of Jerusalem. On the eastern side, just outside the eastern gate of the wall of the old city Jerusalem, there is a mount called the Mount of Olives. At the foot of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, or the wine press. Now, we've all heard of the Mount of Olives. There on the east stood this Mount of Olives. In the middle of the city, or through the valley in the next mount, I should say, is the Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount, as we heard it called many times. That's the next hill or mount that is there in Jerusalem. It could have been the very same place where Abraham took Isaac to offer him to God. Remember, as a sacrifice, he went to Mount Moriah. God led him to Mount Moriah, to the place that he was to offer Isaac. Of course, God stopped it before it took place. But it could have been the very exact same spot that the temple set. There on the Temple Mount is where Abraham was going to offer Isaac. We don't know. Some say no. Well, if God done the guiding of where Abraham was to go, God could have took him to the very same spot. 1,000 years later, after Abraham and Isaac, King David bought a threshing floor there on Mount Moriah from Araunah. And we know that he built an altar there, and he built an altar there to give a sacrifice to the Lord, to stop the plague, to hold the plague back from the people of the nation of Israel. That's 2 Samuel 24, 18 and 21. What was taking place, David was numbering the children of Israel. And God didn't tell him to, and God was filled with anger because David took it upon himself to do it. And so God sent a plague, death, a plague upon the nation of Israel because of King David's sin. And God stopped the plague, the angel of death, right there at Araunah's threshing floor, right there on Mount Moriah. And so David went. He knew where it had stopped. 70,000 Israelites were killed by this plague, men up to this point. And so David went and bought the threshing floor to give a sacrifice and may build an altar there to God where this plague was stopped, at this threshing floor. And so that's the reason for him buying the threshing floor in order to make an altar. And then after David died, his son, King Solomon, on the very same spot there on the Mount Moriah, built a temple. Solomon's great temple was built on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. Araunah's threshing floor, possibly the very place where Abraham was going to offer Isaac. And then, of course, the third mount is Mount Zion, and it's on the far west of the city of Jerusalem. Now, in order to have three mountains, you're going to have three valleys, and that's what we're reading about in Jeremiah 19. And these three valleys that are in Jerusalem, between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, is the Kidron Valley, there on the east. Between those two, going up out of the Kidron Valley, is the eastern gate. Remember, when Jesus returns, he's going to come in the eastern gate of the city. Well, that is out of the Kidron Valley. That's going to be the path that he'll take at his second coming. And this is also known, the Kidron Valley is also known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat. It's the same valley. In Jerusalem itself, in the old city, between the Temple Mount and Mount Zion, there was a valley that split. Now, when I'm talking about valley, it wasn't like the Grand Canyon. You know, it wasn't so sloped, the size that they couldn't build homes and so forth in the city. But the next valley, there inside, that divided the old city in half, was the Tyropoeon Valley. Now, the Tyropoeon Valley we know because when Herod was king, remember, he added to the temple. He made it spread it out a little bit more, done a vast building complex to the temple. And that's the reason it was called, after that point, Herod's Temple. And he built a western wall, which is still there today. We know it as the Wailing Wall. It's where all the Jews go to worship in our day. Jews in Jerusalem do not worship on any mount. They worship in the lowest part of the city, which shows that they're placed with God and God's placed with them. And then after Mount Zion, the third mount, the next valley is the Hinnom Valley, which is mentioned here. The Hinnom Valley is in Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word for it, but for the Greek word for it, you'll find it in the New Testament, is Gehenna. The Gehenna Valley, or hell. Jesus talked about the Gehenna Valley. He used it many times as the illustration of what hell would be like. At the southern part of the city, now understand, the Hinnom Valley, or the Gehenna Valley, run on the western side, right outside the western wall of Jerusalem. And it curled unto the southern part of Jerusalem, the city. And the southern part of the city of Jerusalem was the dung gate, where all the waste and all the garbage in Jesus' day was carried out and was dumped there in the valley of Gehenna, and it burned. Criminals that were executed or died were thrown into this heap, this garbage heap. And it wouldn't flame up, but it was like, like you were burning leaves. They're burning on the bottom. It smoked continuously. There was a continual burning of this garbage heap in this valley. And Jesus said that's what hell's going to be like. It's going to be where those that are unworthy. The criminals to God are going to be cast, and it's going to be a place of never-ending fire. And the stench that was put on the southern side of Jerusalem, because the wind always blew to the south, and it wouldn't blow the stench of rotting animals and the waste of animals and human waste. They didn't have sewer. They took it out the dung gate and dumped it in the Gehenna Valley. There it would burn, along with dead animals, dead people, and plus all their garbage. It was a garbage dump that burned continuously. But thankfully, the wind, that's the reason it was put on the south. The wind blew south, toward the south, and they didn't have to smell it. It was, the smoke would go for miles. There wasn't any flame, as I said. There was only smoke. But we're talking in Jeremiah's day. What is the cause for the judgment that is coming on Judah and Jerusalem? He said, because of the valley of Tophath. The valley of Tophath means a place of fire or a place of burning. But it also means a place of drums. The Hinnom Valley, its name is going to be changed according to verse 4 and verse 5 that we read, into the valley of slaughter. Why? He tells us, because you are burning your sons as sacrifices. Israel had taken in the Hinnom Valley a place and had built a place, and you read this time and time again in Isaiah and Kings and so forth, where they mention this over and over, the worship of Molech, the pagan god of Molech, which came probably, we don't know exactly how the worship of Molech came to Jerusalem or to the Israelites, but it probably was through Solomon. Remember, God told Solomon not to be marrying these strange women, these pagan women, and he did it anyway, and how they persuaded him to follow these other gods, the gods of the Ammonites. Well, this was a god of the Ammonites and the Canaanites. And so probably Solomon brought all of that in this pagan worship and idol worship into Jerusalem and into Israel as he was a king with all those pagan wives. But they were offering babies to Molech, a pagan god. It was a god with a human body, but with a bull's head. If you can imagine that, with horns. It was a metal or iron statue or iron idol with its arms and its hands stretched forth. And some say that a fire was built within the idol that would heat up this iron. Others say that fire was built around this idol of iron, and this fire that was built around it would heat up the idol. But people and women and men and couples would bring their babies with less than a year old, and they would bring them to the high priest of Molech, and Molech would take the children and without getting too close to that, that fire, and too close to the hot iron of that god, that idol of that god, Molech, they would toss these babies into the red hot iron arms of Molech as a sacrifice. Can you imagine someone taking their baby, throwing it onto a hot iron idol, burn yourself? I mean, just a little burn hurts. Hurts terribly, doesn't it? You imagine being a baby. I mean, almost, it sounds so horrible that here we are 2,500 years later, that almost brings tears to our eyes thinking about somebody doing a baby that way. It breaks our heart to hear stories like that. The baby would, if you will, for a better choice of words, would sizzle there in the arms of this pagan god, until it was burned enough that it would fall through the arms and into the fire, and to be totally devoured by the fire. Of course, it was dead before it ever hit the fire. And because of that, God said, you are going to pay an awesome price. It's also known as the Valley of Drums, because as these priests would cast these newborns, these babies, into the iron of Molech, or into the arms of Molech, other priests would play on cymbals and play on flutes, and most of all beat drums. Now, that went on the whole time the worship was taking place, but the beating of the drums got even more fierce, and even louder, more rapid, if you will, as the baby was cast into the arm of Molech to cover the sound, the screams and the cries of those infants, so that the parents and the people, mothers, couldn't hear the cries of their children as they burned and fell into the fire of this pagan god. As we already said, the judgment that is coming. Look at verse 7. God said, and I will make void the counsel of Judah and Jerusalem in this place, and I will cause them to fall by the sword before their enemies, by the hands of them that seek their lives. Their carcasses will I give to be meat for the fowls of the heavens and for the beasts of the earth. Keep this verse in mind. He said, I'm going to destroy you with your enemies, those that seek your life. They're going to take your life because of what you've done. He said, not only that, he said, but your carcasses, your bodies are going to lay out in the open. Now, this was the worst thing a Jew could ever hear. This was awful to a Jew. Not to be buried was the worst thing a Jew could imagine to ever happen to them. That was awful news. And not only that, not to be buried, but to be eaten by the beasts of the earth, the dogs, the cats, the rats, the buzzards. This was awful news to the Jew. They just simply weren't going to be buried. What does all of this have to do with us? What does all of this have to do with me and you? We're not Jews. We're not following after Molech. We're not sacrificing any human sacrifices. So how does this apply to us today? What can we learn from this story and this idea of chapter 19 in the book of Jeremiah. In 1973, there was a Supreme Court case that was decided. You know it as Roe versus Wade. 1973. Some of you remember that year, don't you? Maybe not all the details of it, but it's been in your lifetime. Some, you weren't even born yet. It's 47 years ago. 47 years ago, the Supreme Court legalized abortion. And let's don't call it abortion. Abortion dehumanizes it. Let's call it the aborting of babies, because that's what it is. It's not a medical procedure like having your tonsils took out. Let's call it what it is. Don't just call it abortion. That's too neutral. It's the aborting of babies. Since 1973, in the U.S., in our nation alone, in 47 years, 61 million. You hear what I said? 61 million babies have been aborted. Well, that may not strike you as anything. Let me put it this way. 61 million babies aborted in 47 years. That's 1.3 million babies per year on the average. 1,300,000 babies aborted in the United States in the last 47 years. Well, maybe that's too far for you to think. Think of it this way. For the last 47 years, 365 days a year, every day for 47 years, 3,500 babies have been aborted in this nation. Every day for 47 years, 3,500. That's no telling how many millions. If we don't even count those that were aborted in the last 20 years, the millions before the last 20 years, how many millions of lives, of cars that could have been bought, homes that could have been bought, jobs that could have been bought, taxes that could have been paid, Social Security that could have been paid in. Social Security going broke. Well, you killed all the payers. Those aborted in 1973 would be, of course, 74 or 47 years old. They'd be buying, selling, producing. Paid. Finding cures for diseases. Getting the gospel out. Missionaries around the world. We could just go on and on and on. We live in a time and a day when we are faced with the coronavirus. We've been given all kinds of restrictions. We have to wear a mask. We have to wash our hands. We have to keep our distance. And even we have to shelter in place. Restrictions after restrictions after restrictions. We've been filled with fear. Our nation has seen death because of this virus. An astonishing 219 or so thousand Americans have died from this virus. Since, February, March, let's just say in the last 8 months, 220,000 Americans have died because of this coronavirus. That's equal to 61 days of abortions in this nation. 2 months. What corona has done in 8 months, abortion does in 2 months' time. And does anybody say anything about it? Have you seen it anywhere on the news? All we hear is the virus is up. More people have it. Doesn't say more people's dying, but more people have it. More people have it. Do they say anything about all the children, the unborn that are being killed before they ever get a start? No. We've got all these restrictions and limitations with this virus that isn't a drop in the bucket to the death that is going on in our nation. Where'd these babies come from that were offered to Molech? In the worship of Molech, not only were there the sacrifice of these children, but to draw people in, especially men, there were prostitutes. In the worship of Molech, there was prostitution. Now, there wasn't any birth control in that day. And if they had hundreds of prostitutes in the worship of Molech, that is hundreds of babies that are going to be born to these prostitutes. So these prostitutes would offer their babies to be burned for Molech. Why? The main reason was because a prostitute doesn't want a baby. They were unwanted. As long as girls and women in this nation play the role of a prostitute, there's going to be unwanted children, even with birth control. The children offered to Molech was unwanted, just like the children aborted today are unwanted. But not only were there the prostitutes of the worship of Baal, but there was married couples that had children. Now remember, Molech is their god that they worship. Molech is going to help them. Molech is going to answer and fulfill their need. And Molech is going to help them make, if you will, ends meet or straighten out the problems in their life. And so in order to get Molech, their god, to do these things for them, they would offer a sacrifice of their child to Molech. Or in other words, they would give their child so that somewhere down the road, Molech would bless them and meet their need, or, whatever the case may be. Or in other words, the couples offered their children to Molech to have a better future for themselves. What are the two reasons for killing children today? Number one, they're unwanted. And number two, they'll just be a hindrance to someone else's life. They want the blessings, the fun, the looseness, the future. It'll ruin their future. So let's get rid of it. We can't afford a child. let's abort it. We've got to think about what we have. We've got to think about ourselves. Let's get rid of it. How could they do this? You think about how horrible, how could a parent, a mother, see their baby thrown into the arms and into the fire of Molech? Listen, people can get so caught up in evil that wickedness gives them a sense of pleasure. A lot of times doing what you're not supposed to do makes it that much more pleasurable. These people were so wicked, so evil, that they were getting pleasure out of what they were doing. It's the same sense, the same as a serial killer. Why do they keep killing? It's because it's pleasure to them. Listen. The problem is not the law. Whether abortion is legal or not doesn't make any difference. It does not make any difference whatsoever. The problem is not the clinics that perform the abortions. That is not the problem. The problem is the wickedness of the mind and the heart of people who perform the abortions and the people who have abortions performed. That's where the problem is. It's not the law. It's that people have gotten so evil and so ungodly. All we hear is the beating of the drums, right? All you hear is the beating of the drums. Watch the news. You'll hear the beating of the drums to cover up the sound of what really is going on. Women's rights. This is right. The majority of Americans believe in this. Covering up the sounds of the cries of the unborn being killed. Millions every year. Listen to the beating of the drums to cover up what's really taking place. It's the wickedness of the heart, the wickedness of the mind. America's problem is not abortions. America's problem is we have gotten so far away from what is right and what is godly. That's the problem. How did America get that way? It got that way when the church got that way. When you know it and don't live it and don't profess it, don't blame it on politicians or the Supreme Court or the ungodly. You let this nation get ungodly. Because you've been traveling right along with them, right in their footsteps. What used to be wrong is suddenly right today. How did that change when God said, I'm the same forever? Used to be wrong for a Christian to drink, and now it's the greatest thing in the world. We won't even practice being a hypocrite and showing up for church. We've even got beyond that point. We don't profess it, we don't live it, and we wonder what happened to the world. Their hearts have gotten so wicked because they don't see the light of truth. That is to be the church. That is to be the believer. Let me ask you a very simple question. If God destroyed Jerusalem and Judah because of the sacrificing of children, innocent blood, because of their ungodliness and their wickedness, if God destroyed them, and you go on and read the rest of the chapter, at least down through verse 13, you'll find that people as they walk by and see the ruins are going to be astonished. He even told those that will be left behind, you're going to eat your children. And you're going to eat each other. Because you're going to be starving to death. If you don't go to Babylonian captivity, you're going to turn to cannibalism. You'll eat your children. And you'll eat your neighbor. If God brings that kind of judgment on His chosen people, if God brings the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah on those people, how in this world do you think we're going to escape God's judgment? We're not. What did He say in verse 7? I'll cause your enemy to come in and take you over. Those that would love more than anything in the world to put you to death, I'm going to let them do it. You're going to fall. You're not going to be anything like you used to be. You'll never see that day again. You think we're going to get by? Well, what can I do? You can start by being what you claim to be. Just be what you claim to be. Believe what you claim to believe. Live what you claim